Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another player ranking for a recently finished Survivor season. This time, talking about Survivor 48, where again, like all my other rankings, I'll be ranking the players based on how I feel like they played on the season. And again, we have 18 players to rank here, so let's start off at number 18. The person who I think played the worst game on the season is actually shockingly not the first boot of the season, not even a person that was booted in the pre-merge. Kind of. I mean, technically they were voted out the pre-merge if you want to go by proper Survivor standards. Either way, we got Charity. Again, obviously this is a little bit of a weird pick considering Charity makes it relatively deep into the game, but Charity also is someone that I think plays pretty terribly. She's really on the bottom the entire game. Where again, on the original Siva tribe, they ever lost a challenge, it felt like Charity was going to be the one to go. At the swap tribe, it also felt like Charity would have been a very contender to go. Mind you, it's not 100% there. It felt like it would have been between her and Star, though even then, I would actually give the odds to Charity. And then we get to Emerge, where she's just the first person out, where no one really wanted to work with her outside of Mitch. So where, again, I'll at least give her credit that she had Mitch as a pretty solid ally at that point in the game. But that's really the only true positive to give her, as everything else about her game is really bad. And she's just on the bottom the entire time, on her way out the entire time, and just never loses an immunity challenge to actually get taken out until Emergatory. In a spot where, again, even her own original tribe ends up flipping against her, and it felt like a spot where people were like kind of priming it up for Charity to be the Emergatory boot for rounds at that point, where we even see like Camila throw Charity under a bus at the swap, to where again, it just feels like Charity had no legs on this season. In a spot where I just feel like she probably does more wrong in the game than the next person I'll be talking about. So again, she had so many opportunities to make bonds in the game and just never did it outside of Mitch, to where it just felt like she was just such a foregone conclusion as the first person to go at any time that she would go to Tribal, to where there really was no potential there for Charity. So again, she's here at number 18. Now number 17, moving on to a player that also went out the first opportunity and also is the actual first boot. We got Stephanie. And Stephanie's this weird player. I don't actually think Stephanie's that bad of a first boot. I mean, while she was, again, the first person now, I don't feel like she does that much actively wrong to be in that position, to where, again, it just made it a lot easier for put Charity at the bottom because of that, where, again, I do think Stephanie is a player that gets pretty unfortunate just based on how the original tribes played out. I think Stephanie's in a spot here where, again, I think you definitely criticize her for being a bit too passive early on. She didn't really solidify her alliances well enough. But really, I don't think she does that much actively wrong. It's more so just a spot where, say, gathers all the men together, and at that point, she's just outnumbered. And it felt like a spot where she was targeted because they looked at her as a threat. And to be fair, again, I think you could definitely credit Mary for having like a connection to at least like Kevin, where he would want to keep her safe over Stephanie. But I really don't feel like Stephanie does that much actively wrong to be a first boot. I think she just gets a pretty unfortunate tribe breakdown in a spot where, again, I think she hesitated at the very beginning, and that just led her be in a spot where she was kind of down in the numbers. But even then, she still had Mary as a number one ally. And again, that's the thing that like does keep her in line with Charity. Where, again, the one positive for Charity is the fact that she had Mitch as an ally. Again, like technically Stephanie had Mary as well. And I think Stephanie also did less wrong in the game than Charity. And to be fair, Charity obviously had more time in the game to do more wrong in the game, but I still think in this spot, their games are not that dissimilar in the grand scheme of things. Yeah, I just feel like Charity does more wrong across her run and had more opportunities for success that she ended up failing at. But Steph, again, kind of just lost that opportunity on the offset and was never able to recover from it, which I don't put as much blame onto her for as I do with Charity, who had just, again, more opportunities. So again, for me, Stephanie's here at number 17. At number 16, moving one step ahead to Kevin. And Kevin straight up, again, I don't think is that bad either. But really, I think this is a season of pretty competent, where I think this is really a season where a lot of the earlier boots were actually pretty decent, considering their placements, to where, again, it kind of made this list a bit tough to put together. But again, Kevin's a player here, though, that I do think made a mistake along the way that I feel justified putting him this low, even though, again, I think he gets very unfortunate. The fact that he gets injured right away. Also gets sent on the journey, which, again, should have put him in a tougher spot to build connections. Even despite that, had a connection with Mary. And it seemed to have a lot of agency in the game. Again, seemed to be in the middle during that first vote. And then during the second vote, he tried to lead the charge against Say. And it seemed to be effective at first. I think a major issue here for me with Kevin is the fact that I do think he should have made a different move in the first round. Where, again, I do think optimally he should have been trying to get to the top of the pecking order instead of staying at the bottom of his alliance, where even he admits the fact that he was never particularly close to like Justin and Cedric, to where, again, like I just don't think going with the Justin Cedric Say side of things was the right call for him. I think he should have at least tried to pull off some like 3-2-1 or pull off some sort of tie situation with Steph and Mary while they were there and try to get on the top of the pecking order, but ultimately doesn't here. And again, I think ultimately it's a spot where Kevin still, again, doesn't do that much wrong. And during his boot round, I don't think he does anything particularly wrong. I think he was playing optimally, again, trying to get out Say, which was the right call for him. The problem is, again, he just didn't really have the room to actually do that move to begin with, as again, Justin and Cedric were never truly with him. So again, it's one that I don't even think his game is that bad, but just again, a lot of the earlier boots here were people that got very unfortunate how things played out. So ultimately, I am going to have Kevin here at number 16. Now number 15. Now moving on to a player that I really want to put higher, and I think you think that they would be higher considering the placement on the season. Yeah, at number 15, I'm going to go Star. And Star's is a very tough case on this list here because Star, I think, has some potential for the game. I think she does have some pretty accurate reads in the game. I think she had some awareness of where her game was and what she needed to do. The problem is that she's so ineffective in doing any of that. And despite the fact that she gets to 8th place, she's really in a spot where she's on the bottom really the entire time. She's in a spot where she would have just outright gone home on the original Logi had they gone to Tribal, which I think is a major negative there for me. Again, that's something that definitely puts her in line with, again, some of these earlier boots on the board. And even though she does end up surviving that and gets to merge, she's still on the bottom the entire time. While she does vote with the majority, it's not because she's particularly insulated within any real group. Again, despite the fact that she gives her idol to Eva, which again, I still stand by being the correct decision, she still was not able to turn that around to actually build any social capital with Eva. And I think that is a major failing on Star's end. Now again, I will at least give her credit for the fact that she tried to pull off this 4-4 vote when she goes out, where again, at least she had like some numbers around her, but even then, again, gets taken out there. Also just blindside when David goes home as well, which isn't good. And I just think in general, again, Star's game, not particularly strong, despite the fact that she makes it very deep, to where I think she's probably a better player than what her placement on this list is. As again, I do think she at least has the somewhat stable strategic mind for the game, but I do think the way that she ends up navigating through the game is not particularly strong enough to put her much higher on this list, especially considering, again, she would have been the first boot had Logi ever just went to Tribal. So ultimately, again, I do have her here at number 15. Now number 14, moving on to a player that I had a tough time assessing here because I think this is a player that got really screwed in the game, gets so unlucky at a lot of things happening, but also made their own bed as well. And originally I did have him higher on the list, yet the more I thought about it, I did end up having to drop her here, specifically because I feel like her going out here was, again, more so on her, and that person is Bianca. And again, Bianca's a player here that I think has potential. Again, she had her alliance with Thomas early on Logi. She seemed to have a pretty stable strategic mind for the game. And again, like when she ends up telling Cedric that she had lost her vote, which again ends up leading to Cedric turning the votes on her, I at least get her rationale for doing so. Even though, again, I think it's her being a bit too cute and her putting a lot more faith into her relationship with Cedric than she probably should have. But still, I think Bianca's in this spot here where, like, I again think she's probably a better player than what her placement on this list signifies, especially considering, again, I think she was pretty screwed in the game. Again, she was in a decent spot in the original Logi. Mind you, not a perfect spot. She definitely was probably on the lower end of the pecking order there, where, again, while I do think Star would have been the first to go, if they went to a Tribal again after that, I do think Bianca is a very likely boot at that point, considering I do think Joe and Shiaen would have sided with Eva. So again, not perfectly positioned there, but again, like, obviously was not going to be the first boot there. But at the swap, again, she's put in a very unfortunate position to where, while she is, again, the only person, to where while she is someone that is essentially in the middle of two sides after the swap, she's also a person that doesn't have her vote, which is obviously a bad position to be in, where, again, she just lost it because of the journey, which again is still dumb. While also she's in a position where Vula is so outnumbered that there really ends up becoming this Logi versus Siva war, where again Chrissy in particular is someone that's very gung-ho about wanting a Logi out. And I think that's also very unfortunate for Bianca. Again, in most given situations, should be the swing vote. That should be the person that decide which of the two sides she goes with, but instead ends up being just instantly targeted instead. Though even then, it seemed like there was a point where she was able to turn it around. She built a good connection with Mitch, and felt like Say was potentially going home until, obviously, again, she reveals that she lost her vote, to where it just becomes easy to put the votes on her, which again, I think is entirely on her. And again, that's the reason why I did end up putting her at this point in the list, is because at the end of the day, she doesn't survive a single Tribal. Mind you, obviously, very unlucky circumstances within that, but again, still doesn't survive a Tribal, and also is at fault for her elimination. To where, while again she was definitely screwed to be in that position to begin with, she also misplays that situation poorly enough to where I ultimately put her below the next couple people we'll be talking about, who again did make it further than her and did survive more Tribals than her. To where, while I think Bianca might be a better player than those people, at the end of the day, I felt like Bianca has enough holes here to put her here number 14. Now number 13. Now we're moving on to a player that is a very flawed player, but also someone that survives a good chunk of Tribals, and that person is Say. And again, Say is this player here that I really did not know what to do with, as she's someone that, again, on paper was in a dominant alliance early on, and she's the one that forms the majority on the original Vula tribe, and gets Cedric and Justin together, gets Kevin on board, again, does a lot of active work there, and wins the battle against Stephanie. Again, that is definitely a lot to credit her for. The problem is that she's really on the bottom of that alliance, despite the fact that she makes that alliance, where, again, she ends up getting talked about as being even a target during that first round. During the second round, she was going to be the target until a last second change from Cedric and Justin, which, again, at least credit her for having this really strong bond on Cedric, to where, again, he wanted to keep her safe. But still, it felt like she was just on the bottom of that alliance, even though, again, to be fair, she ultimately ends up being, like third out of a group of 6, which isn't the worst thing in the world if you don't lose challenges over and over again. But ultimately, again, we get to, like, the Mary boot round, where, again, it should have been her. But ultimately, we get to the Justin boot round, where really it was going to be her once Mary played that shot in the dark. And to be fair, again, she ends up convincing Cedric to keep her by the end, but it's still a spot where she needed to be in that position to convince Cedric to keep her at the end. Where I think there's a major failing there in her not putting her vote into Justin to begin with, which would have saved her to begin with. And I think that's definitely something I'll criticize Say for. But still, again, I think her early game there, even if she were to go out in that Justin spot, again, that would have been a very unfortunate position, and she would have been a pretty solid early boot there. I think the thing that ends up knocking Say down a little bit more here is, again, her game after that, where really she's just on the bottom the rest of the time, despite the fact that, again, she gets into a situation where at the swap, again, she was in a spot where she should have had an ally in Cedric keeping her around, and ultimately does, technically. She's still in a spot where, again, there was a point where she was going to get voted out there, and kind of gets saved due to Bianca making a mistake more so than anything Say actively does. And then once we get to merge, she's really just on the bottom. She's just, like, waiting to get picked off, where, again, it was just her Charity goes over her, and then she goes in the following round. Mind you, that was a split tribal spot where at the time of the split tribal, she was given no real chance to save herself, especially due to Mitch playing his block a vote on her. But it was still a spot where, again, I think that is something to at least give her like a little bit of credit her for the fact that, again, who knows who would have gone home if there was no split tribal. Mind you, again, I would not be shocked if it was Say anyway, but still, it's a spot where, yeah, I do think Say gets unfortunate there and gets unfortunate points early on in the game, but still, I do think as a whole, her game's just kind of middling. One where really from the point that she's off of Vula, she's really just dangling on the bottom, not really able to gain any inroads, and really even beyond that, and even really before that, she was still not particularly well positioned for long term, to where, and I do think Say is a player here that, again, is definitely skilled for the game, definitely has some good attributes, but ultimately I do look at her as still a pretty flawed player. She's here number 13. Now number 12, and now number 12 we're going with a bit of a strange pick, as number 12 we're going with someone that, again, made it pretty deep into the game, but ultimately I think plays a very flawed game still, and that person is Mary. And again, Mary's in this spot here where, again, take out her early stretch on Vula, she probably is higher on this list. Again, she probably is closer to like the midpoint in this list. Yeah, again, like her original positioning on Vula is really bad. Obviously, she's blindsided twice in a row, both when Stephanie goes home and then when Kevin goes home, all very bad. And then she proceeds to need a shot in the dark to save herself in episode 3, where, again, if that had not happened, she's gone in episode 3 and she's been in the conversation for one of the worst players of the season. Where, again, I think her first 3 episodes are atrociously bad, where she's never in the know of what's going on. She's always on the bottom, and even then needed a shot in the dark to save herself. And again, I think that is a really terrible run for someone that has gone to 3 tribals, and a major reason why she's relatively low on this list, where, again, like, she shouldn't even technically made it past episode 3. However, I think she recovers her game after that. Obviously, she ends up putting him on with David at the swap and seemed to be in a pretty good position at the swap tribe. Then at the merge, she's able to find herself in the strong person alliance, which being the only person not deemed strong to be inside of it, which, again, I think is very impressive play there. Mind you, her and David become massive targets, and she's eventually blindsided when David ends up going home and ends up being back on the bottom. But again, I think there is some pretty good play from Mary during that portion of the game. That is the main reason why she's as high on the list as she is here. Then we get through boot round where, I mean, at least she tries. Again, we see her pitching to everybody to take out Joe, is obviously unsuccessful in doing so, which is, again, still a failing on her. But yeah, I at least do like that there is this scrappiness there from Mary, but it's still a spot where, again, she's largely ineffective in pretty much everything she does. Or in terms of, like, actually trying to get a vote to go through, there's never really a point where she actively gets her way. And even in that portion of the game where she is in the majority, she's trying to push for a Camila boot and she just can't actually do it. While, again, I do think there was a lot of good work in the middle of the game to get herself into that strong 6 alliance, I do think the game surrounding her is not particularly great. To where, again, in comparison to Say, I think it is pretty close. And again, obviously, I think Say outplays her during early portions of the game. I think Mary outplays her during the middle portions of the game. To where, ultimately, I think they are pretty close. I do think the fact that, obviously, just Mary made it a lot further in the game than Say is something that, again, I'll give the slight edge to her, even though I could definitely see an argument for the opposite. But again, at the end of the day, I do have Mary here at number 12. Now number 11, and now we're moving back to some earlier boots. At number 11, I do have Thomas. And Thomas was a bit of a debate here, specifically because Thomas is a player that technically gets voted out at his first ever tribal. He doesn't survive a single tribal. The circumstances around that are obviously very unfortunate. He gets ironed out of the game after a swap in a position where I think the game kind of lines up to where he kind of has to be the person they take out, which again, I think is very unfortunate for him. So where again, while he is swapped into a majority, he is swapped into a majority with two people that have advantages. And through that, Camila and Kyle obviously use these against her in a spot where they're incentivized to take out Thomas because Thomas went on a journey and they are worried about him potentially having some sort of advantage to use against them in the following round. So through that, you're kind of forced to take out Thomas in that spot. And again, I think that is very unlucky for Thomas. Along with the fact that, again, he was obviously in a pretty good position on his original tribe. Mind you, I think probably oversold how good of a position he was, where while he does have the California girls, I think ultimately he was outnumbered within the California girls, where I think Joe and Shiaen were the closer pair than he had, where, again, I do think had they gone to a tribal after the star boot, I think Thomas would have likely lost that battle there. But still, he was in a pretty good position early on. He was right in the middle of things and gets completely screwed by way the swap ends up breaking out here. Now, mind you, within that, I think there's also some poor play. Him lying to his alliance about his vote steal, I think was pretty dumb. We also see him failing to get his way, where he wanted Camila to go instead of Kyle and was not able to push that through to where, again, there are still some failings there. Yeah, I think ultimately him going out in the way that he does was very unfortunate. I think a lot of unlucky circumstances had to play out for that to end up occurring. Again, like, he had so much longevity in the game. Again, I think if he doesn't get sniped out in that position, he has so much leg room following that. Again, he still has the California girls. He's also someone that just seems so affable socially, to where, again, I feel like he would have been able to make some moves towards the back portion of the game that we see a lot of other people don't. So where ultimately, again, I think Thomas ends up probably being one of the better pre-jury players in the history of the show. So again, he's here at number 11. Now number 10, moving on to a player that I don't feel like played particularly well. Yeah, they're kind of this high because at least they were in a majority at a point and they did survive some votes, and that person is Chrissy. And again, Chrissy is this player here that I think her early game is actually pretty decent. Like, obviously, right away, she's in the majority on the original Siva tribe. Doesn't seem to have ever been in danger had they ever gone to tribal early on. So again, I think that's something to definitely give her credit for. Then we get to swap, where she's once again in the majority. She is able to build a bomb with Cedric to where it seems like her, Cedric, and Mitch were the true power of that group, though really at the end of the day, obviously, by the time of tribal, ends up being a bit of a mess. But still, she ends up being the one that Cedric loops into the Bianca vote, and I think that's something to definitely give her credit for. Now, obviously, everything crumbles at the merge, where it really just felt like, again, for most people that weren't in that strong person alliance, their game crumbles at the merge, where she was kind of left on the outs of that, which is very strange considering, again, Siva obviously had the majority. Also, again, she seemed to have a pretty good relationship with David early on, where the fact that it just like completely goes nowhere after the merge, I think you still put it as a failing on her, the fact that David was not really willing to even keep her as an option at that point. But still, I still think obviously there's a lot of poor play there, especially by the end. And again, while she is able to stay over Charity, she's able to stay during the split vote tribal, she still is, again, really burning relationships along the way. Again, her calling people out at tribal, which is kind of insane. And she really just becomes the consensus target by the time of her boot round, where while there was, again, this like potential push to take out Camila, it wasn't really due to anything Chrissy did. It felt like she was just kind of on the outs at that point. Oh, yeah, I think at the end of the day, I do think Chrissy just has a bit of a messy game, but one that actually was pretty decent early on, but one that, again, just has her complete self-sabotaging by the end. So again, I end up leaving here at number 10. Now number 9, moving on to a player that makes it way deeper into the game, but also plays a much more flawed game, and that person is Mitch. And Mitch is a tough player here, as, again, he obviously makes it much deeper into the game. Also a spot where, again, he is technically voting with the majority. Actually does find himself within the majority a bit more than, again, someone like a Star we talked about earlier, but also still not particularly well positioned in the game. And I think this is his thing with Mitch, is that he is, again, kind of on the outs for a lot of the game. He does spend the initial game, again, on the outs of Charity. Though obviously Charity is still the priority over him, which, again, I'll give him minor credit for. Same thing goes with the swap, where, again, he's technically on the outs when Bianca goes home, but I actually think he was doing good work in trying to build a relationship with Bianca, to where, again, they seem to want to work together if they got into the merge. Also in a spot where I think that vote is just so flimsy as is, the fact that everything happened in the last second, to where I don't really fault him for that. Also, again, he builds a good connection with like Cedric. I think he comes into a merge like in a not terrible position, only for, again, just nothing really working in his favor. And to be fair, this is a season where obviously the strong alliance comes together, and I think that is pretty unfortunate for Mitch, that he kind of gets left out of that from the very beginning, especially considering he's associated with Charity, who is his big social pariah. But again, once Charity goes, I actually don't hate his play for next few rounds. While, again, he is never able to actually make a move against a strong alliance, he's able to actually find his way inside it, despite the fact that there's a lot of talk about how much of a threat he would be if he got to the end. And I think that is actually pretty impressive of Mitch, that he builds a bond with, again, the likes of Joe and Shiaen, to where, again, they end up wanting to keep him around and trust him enough to put him as their like 5 or 6. Also, again, we have him like staying over David, which I think is good as well. Obviously, like towards the end of the game, it gets very frustrating the fact that he doesn't end up making a move, though. Obviously, that final 8 round is one where, again, like, what do you have to lose? I think you might as well take a shot, and ultimately he is the person that shuts that all down, and again, that is very bad. And ultimately, he just obviously easily gets voted out of 5 in a spot where he doesn't have a chance to save himself, and Cal and Camila just let him go, despite technically could have had the numbers. Now, again, I will at least give a minor bit of credit to Mitch in the fact that it seemed like he was at least a modicum of a jury threat. It seemed like he would have potentially beat Joe and Eva. He got into the end of them. I think the problem is that obviously the way he played the game made it very unlikely that he actually gets to the end with them, and really just, again, left his game open for a spot where it seemed like he was just banking on winning Final 5 immunity and hoping that they let him go to 4 and then he would be confident in fire making. But again, it just feels like he spent a lot of his game just hoping that things work out for him more than actually doing something. I feel like that is the frustrations with Mitch here, to where, again, while I did consider putting him higher on this list because he at least had that monicum of win equity and got deep into the game, I think the problem is that he was never actually part of any true core alliance. Someone that, again, just seemed to be kind of dragged throughout a lot of the game, did not really even make a move of his own, and even then was just relying on luck by the end, where ultimately I think Mitch's game is, again, just very lackluster, even though he did have a winning scenario. And again, it's enough for me to put him here at number 9. Now, number 8, we're finally moving on to the last pre-merger on the list. Again, a player that I think is possibly one of the most screwed over players in Survivor history, to where, while obviously they did do things wrong along the way, still probably had a lot of potential on the season had they not been sniped out of the game in that spot, and that person is Justin. And again, Justin is quite possibly one of the most screwed over players in Survivor history. I think he is put in this position where so many unlucky circumstances had to happen for him to go out, in a spot where his game up to that point was pretty solid. Again, he was actually able to position himself to become the second best position in the Vula tribe, where, again, he was alongside Cedric. He was the person that Cedric was actually loyal to. And again, I think that is very impressive, especially when he had a lot of agency early on. Again, he was the swing vote, taking out Stephanie. He then was the person that organized the Kevin vote. So again, I think there's a lot of credit to be given there. And obviously in his boot round, he gets very unlucky in how everything plays out. Again, he gets picked for a journey, loses his vote. Even in that spot, it wouldn't have mattered had it not been for Mary playing a shot in the dark, again, literally getting a 1 in 6 chance to save herself, and does. And then beyond that, even then was in a spot to survive until, again, the final deliberation where Say outplays him there. And again, it's a spot where I do struggle with how much to fault Justin for. Again, it was just very unlucky for him to even be in that position to begin with. But again, I do think he clearly loses the fight against Say at the very end. He also, again, does obviously continuously lie to Cedric in a spot where I think that was also unnecessary. Again, I think there are definitely things to criticize from Justin's game towards the end here, but I do think his game is actually still pretty good for a person booted this early, where in many cases these faults don't end up mattering. Like, really, his debate between him and Say should not even happen to begin with. Him lying to Cedric, again, was definitely not optimal gameplay, but it was a spot where I kind of get where he's coming from. Again, I think it's a very tough game to assess. We're really taking out his boot round. Again, I think he was playing pretty well and set himself pretty well in his boot round, where, again, it had to take so much for him to go out there. So ultimately, again, I think Justin plays a pretty solid game considering how early he was booted. So that's why he's number 8. Now number 7, and it's kind of funny this player is at number 7 considering obviously a lot of people like to call out how bad of a move this person made. However, at the end of the day, I think this person's game is pretty solid. At number 7, I do have Cedric. And again, the big thing about Cedric here, obviously, is his decision to take out Justin over Say. Again, that was ridiculous. That was a terrible move. And something that, again, I can't really defend him for. However, outside of that, I actually do think Cedric plays a pretty good game, where I think it's kind of understated just how well positioned Cedric was on the original Vula tribe. And while, again, I think you could definitely debate how intentional some of these things were, again, I think the fact that he was right in the middle of the Vula tribe literally gets down to the point where, like, he is the only person to not get any votes through the entire Vula stretch is kind of insane. Again, the fact that he's right away in the majority, he finds himself having a good bottom of Say, a very good bottom of Justin, leads those first 2 votes. Mind you, again, I think Justin's probably the more active player than Cedric, where, again, while we do see him, like, warning Say to play her idol, he doesn't really lead the vote onto Kevin in that second round until Justin does so first. But still, again, like, he's the best position on the original Vula tribe, and I think that's definitely a lot to credit him for. And beyond that, even when he gets to swap, again, he's still in a really good position. He's able to build a bond with Chrissy and with Mitch, to where they become the real power on that side. And again, he's in this position where he also has a bond with Bianca, to where Bianca tells him at the last second that she lost her vote, which allows him to switch the votes onto Bianca. Which I think at the end of the day, again, do I think I would have made that move? Probably not. I actually think that taking out Say would have been better for him than taking out Bianca. But again, he still had a lot of agency during that round, and is the main reason why that round plays out the way it does. Now, again, coming to merge, he's very unfortunate, just kind of on the bottom, and isn't really able to save himself by the time the split tribal. Mind you, I do think he gets very unfortunate that there is a split tribal, where I think that was the point where he was not the next target on the board, and just gets very unlucky in the fact that he is on a tribe with essentially all people that want to work together except for him. Where again, I think he gets taken out of the game in a very unlucky circumstance as well, to where I think actually Cedric plays a pretty understatedly, like, decent game here, to where again, I think you definitely qualm with like how good Cedric is as a player in the grand scheme of things, where again, I don't know how intentional some of his positioning was, but he was always in this position to make these major decisions in the game. And I think that is something to give him a lot of credit for, especially when again, he gets taken out due to unlucky circumstances. Also, even the positions where he has to make these choices, especially in episode 3, that was due to a lot of other unlucky circumstances where he gets really screwed over, and the fact that he has to lose one of his 2 closest allies. So I think Cedric ends up ultimately playing a pretty decent game here. So again, he's here at number 7. Now number 6, moving on to a player that I also think plays a pretty decent game, despite obviously this negative tinge he has towards the end of his run, but still at number 6, I'm going to go David. And David's also a player here that I think actually plays a pretty solid game. Again, really his game up until his last couple rounds was near spotless. Again, he's really in the majority the entire time. He is really running the show, being a major decision maker, being a very vocal, strategic presence. And I think, again, his game really up until like the final 10 is very strong. Where again, he starts off in the majority on the original Vula tribe, instantly in that majority alliance. Also, supposedly was in a real duo of Kyle that's kind of shafted in the edit in favor of Kyle and Camila, but it does seem like Kyle and David were extremely close early on. We're right in the middle, where again, we see like Mitch and Charity pitching to them, to where again, I think that's very good work there. Also at the swap, again, he builds a strong bond with Eva right away, really in the center of that group, to where again, if they ever go to tribal, I think David is the one calling the shots on that tribe as well. And again, when we get to emerge, we see him again forming the strong person alliance and building a bond with Joe, and position himself pretty well at that point. And again, leads the charge against Charity, then leads the charge again during the split tribal where he takes out Cedric, in a spot where it seemed like David had most of the power in that grouping. Now beyond that, I think you could definitely flaw his game. I think him taking out Chrissy was again a pretty suboptimal play. Again, I think he should have kept in Chrissy as an option, taking out someone he doesn't have as much connection to. Also beyond that, obviously him fighting with Chrissy on her way out is very bad. Even though, to be fair, it seemed like Chrissy was still pro David on the jury, it still was a spot where like, why are you doing this? Also, that's really the first point where he doesn't really get his way, where obviously again the other option was Camila, who he wanted out. Also again, another Steven member, also another option for him. Though, to be fair, I think Camila is definitely the better option for him. Obviously someone that has ties to a lot of the people within the strong 6 and could have pulled other people away. And again, I think David was playing that optimally, but I think the problem is that it seems like David already had lost the battle, where again, I think it's a spot where while again he didn't trust Shiaen and Kyle, I think it's very clear that Shiaen and Kyle were just closer to Joe and Eva, and I think David was probably on the bottom end of that pecking order either way. Mind you, again, he was able to build a strong bond with Mary, get Mary into this alliance, which I think is very impressive. But again, it was always just a spot where it felt like David was kind of on the bottom of that pecking order, but still, it felt like a pecking order that wasn't going to matter until pretty deep into the game. Obviously, he didn't do himself any favors. Again, him really strong-arming his alliance to try to get Camila out in a spot where they were clearly hesitant, I don't think is a pretty good play, especially in his boot round. I think he really misplays his hand. Mind you, again, I think his entire thing with Joe for like how Joe lied to him. Again, I think, well, again, not good play from David. I think it was also, again, something that was probably taken a bit too overboard. But still, I do think, again, just in general, him like fighting with Kyle and constantly bringing back up the Camila situation, I don't think was good play. But I still feel like David's actually a player that is a pretty solid strategic mind. Again, I think he's someone that, again, like had good reads in the game, knew what he had to do. Just again, a question of could he do it or not, and could he do it especially without burning too much social capital. But still, I think it's a spot where I think David is a pretty understated player here. I do think, again, for David himself, again, him creating this strong person alliance is the way that he has to play. I think that is the way the maneuver through the game. Again, him getting on high horse about it is obviously very bad, but I do think for the most part his game is pretty decent, especially amongst this season, with him again having a pretty clean first half of his game, though it just kind of disintegrates at the very end, but still good enough to be your number 6. Number 5, and at number 5 we're moving on to a player that I did think had a lot of win equity if they got to the end. A player that definitely had some agency throughout the game, was definitely part of the decision making throughout the game, but also does get outplayed by the end, and that player is Shiaen. Now, Shiaen's a player here that I think has a lot of strong suits. Again, he's really in the majority for really the entire game. Yet despite that, he does have some glaring red flags along the way. Again, I think early on, again, he's in the California girls. That's very strong. He also has seemingly a one-on-one bond with Thomas, a one-on-one bond with Joe. Also had Star seemingly wanting to work with him early on. Again, I think there's a lot of good positioning there from Shiaen in the early portions of the game. As we get to the swap, where again, he's kind of a dodo there. Well, while he is technically in the majority and the majority of the votes don't go on to him, it was a spot where I did think he was in a lot of danger. I think if it had not been for a spot where Thomas had previously gone on a journey beforehand, I think there's a serious chance they take the shot at Shiaen, especially considering how much it seemed like Kyle and Camila just didn't trust Shiaen. For seemingly no real reason. It doesn't feel like he ever gave them a major reason to not trust him, but it really feels like this like looming thing across the rest of the season, the fact that they just don't trust him, where we get to the merge, and again, we see Camila and Kyle planting seeds against Shiaen. We see them trying to get David to target him. We see them lying to him about the idol, which again just felt so unnecessary. And again, I do put some of that fault into Shiaen. The fact that he wasn't able to secure them into thinking he was with them in a spot where it seemed like he was. But really, he is just stably in the majority for most of the game. Again, at points getting his way. That really getting highlighted on the show. Again, we get a lot of focus on him wanting Charity out. Charity ends up going. He is kind of dangling during that split tribal vote where it did seem like, again, Kyle and Camila did want to take the shot at him, though, again, it never ends up following through. But again, gets credit for the David move, and that's being clearly something he had been wanting for a while. Also gets credit for the Star move, to where, again, he does get credit for a lot of these moves, and I think that's definitely something to credit for him for. The fact that he is in the majority and getting his way. Yeah, again, I do think his path to that point seemed to be one that, again, some people distrusting him, with David seemingly wanting to take a shot at Shiaen, just, again, assumed he had an idol by that point, so he didn't, which is, again, kind of ironic. Obviously, he just stays the course during the Mary boot round, and then eventually is blindsided the final 6. In a spot where I do think you can attribute some blame to him. Again, the fact that he was talking to Kyle about taking a shot against Joe and Eva, only for him to not actually believe in that, to where, again, it just felt a bit unnecessary at that point. Again, just felt like a spot where he trusted Kyle way more than he should have. Also, beyond that, I don't think he does enough to question Joe and why are you being so aggressive towards me, which I guess Shiaen has clarified that he just assumed it was because of Joe's moment with his sister that causing his change in attitude. But it's still a spot here where I do feel like he really missed an opportunity there to just talk it out and potentially save himself, to where he really just gets blindsided by the end in a spot where he's just completely outplayed by the likes of Kyle and Camila. He burns what is really one of his strong suits of his game, his bond with Joe and Eva, that gave them this very stable ride through the game. And though something to prop up Shiaen is the fact that he seemingly had win equity, now at least the jury told him that he would win if he got to the end, which again is definitely something to prop him up here. The fact that he would, again, potentially beat the likes of Joe and Eva, which was his planned final 3. Which is why I think at the end of the day, again, it makes sense why he doesn't make the move against Joe and Eva. Again, if he did legitimately think he had a shot at beating them, and he probably does, then again, there's no point in taking that shot. And again, he would just have a stable ride to the end. The issue is obviously the fact that he still talked about maybe taking the shot against Joe and Eva, and also still gets outplayed by the end. To where, again, it's definitely a rocky game in the end portions of it, but I do feel like Shiaen, again, plays a pretty stable game for the majority of it. And obviously, like, blindsided the Thomas foe, and also obviously his elimination, but I think for the most part plays a competent enough game, and that's why he's here number 5. Now number 4, now moving on to a player that I was thinking was going to be higher on this list. However, the more I thought about it, the more I just don't think I can justify it based on their path through the game, despite the fact they had a lot of win equity, and that player is Camila. And Camila's a player here that I think has a lot of potential for the game. Again, I think she's someone that is obviously very strategically savvy, a very scrappy player, someone that also seemed to build some pretty good social bonds that kept her safe in the game, but I still think beyond that there is some wonkiness in her game. I think early on, very good work, builds a bond with Kyle, also gets herself into a 4-person alliance that seemed to be running Siva to where, again, I think that's very good. Obviously gets swap screwed, but when she gets swap screwed, I think she plays that extremely well. Again, she's on the bottom alongside Kyle. And to be fair, they're very fortunate the fact that they have an idol there they can utilize, but still it's a position where her and Kyle really snow the loggies in that position, with Camila deserving a lot of the credit for that. Again, she's the one that really enact this and is the one that is actually able to keep herself safe through this, where it really puts Kyle in a lot more danger with him needing to play an idol, while Camila is in a spot here where she's able to avoid all that. Now, once she gets to the merge is something that I'll definitely criticize here. Again, I think the fact that she was not put into that core strong person alliance, especially in a spot where Mary ends up being put into it, I think is definitely a fault there. Now, I get the entire notion that her and Kyle want to keep their relationship secret. Yeah, I think it's still a spot where Camila should have been fighting to get into that alliance, especially considering that entire Vula group outside of her ends up being in that alliance, where we see again that new Vula really come together. Yet despite that, again, she's just kind of left on the outside. And through that, again, that leaves it open for David to want to target her down the road. It really puts herself in the precarious position. Now, I will say, again, she builds strong bonds with Kyle and Shiaen to where they want to keep her around anyway. In a spot where, again, I will definitely fault her for the fact that she wants to take Shiaen out along the way. Where, again, that's a position where that seems ridiculous. The fact that Shiaen was so loyal to her, yet despite that, she's seemingly targeting Shiaen at multiple points in the game, even telling David that he has an idol in an attempt to get David to take Shiaen out, which is, again, just so misguided. And finally, actually ends up putting a target on her at a point in the spot where they think about taking out Camila to avoid Shiaen's idol. Mind you, also ends up helping her down the road as well, where the reason why David ends up targeting Mitch over her during his boot round is because of this fake idol. But still, it wasn't intentional, obviously. And I think it's still a spot where, again, beyond that, yeah, I'll credit her for David going home, but it was still a spot where, again, it felt like Kyle did a lot of the legwork to make that go through over Camila, who we just don't really even see doing too much at that point. And again, we see her, again, attempt to make this 4-4 vote. out. And Star goes home, yet fails at that. And again, I just think it's a spot where Camila is kind of on the bottom from that point on, is kind of relying her entire game on Kyle, which I think is definitely disappointing considering I think her game up to that point is actually pretty good. We then get her also, again, failing to make a move at final 7, despite talk about how Joe's the best target. But then eventually we finally have her making a move at 6 with Kyle. Again, this very impressive play to trick Joe into thinking that Shiaen is coming after him. The problem is that you're not taking out Joe still. Again, I think to make this big play here in a spot where, again, you yourself are talking about how Joe is the biggest threat at the end and then still decide to not take the shot at Joe, I think is a major issue. Now, again, the execution of the move is very impressive. I do think the way they put this plan together, the way that they were able to sell it to Joe, again, is impressive play, but I do think just a major issue here is the fact that, and while obviously they couldn't take the shot at Joe to begin with because he had immunity, the fact that they never even try to take the shot at Joe in this spot is kind of insane. And even more insane, again, not take the shot at Eva, who has an idol. It potentially ruined their plans at 5 also, to where I very much question the shot at Shiaen in particular, where, well, again, you can debate if Shiaen was a bigger jury threat. I do feel like even in this spot, again, I feel like a duo with an idol in their pocket is a lot more dangerous than that. Now, beyond that, again, she obviously wins immunity at 5 in a spot where it did seem like Joe and Eva were at least targeting her, but ultimately, again, I would not be shocked if it was just going to be Mitch anyway, if that didn't happen. But I do think the big criticism for me of Camila, despite the fact that she had a lot of win equity, seemingly if she got to the end, she likely wins, I think a major issue for me is the fact that I just don't think she has a path there. Again, I think the problem is that with how she was playing the game, her entire end game relies on her having to win Final 4 firemaking or Final 4 immunity, which obviously, again, she at least had a shot in some motion, but obviously doesn't win that. But again, once she loses Final 4 immunity, she's essentially screwed. Again, she's such a bad firemaker, seemingly, that I don't think she could beat a single person, which again, that is a major issue there. And I just think her path to the end is just non-existent considering no one was taking her to the end. Again, she was very much relying on Final 4 immunity, which again, she was just never going to win. So through that, again, it just felt like her path to the very end of the game, despite having that win equity, was just so narrow, especially the way that she was playing the game, especially the fact that she was even aware of the fact that Kyle was going to be targeting her at 4 and that Joe and Eva were going to side with Kyle, which I think makes her endgame even worse. And I think that is the thing about Camila's game, is that a lot of her game is based around the concept of her having to do things with Kyle. Again, by the way she was playing from the final 8 on, she simply could not make a move without Kyle's approval. Again, she was not going to go to rocks at final 8 for a chance at taking out Joe and Eva. She couldn't make the move at 7 without Kyle on board as well. And then by the time of the final 6, yeah, she makes the move against Shiaen, but even that was one that was proposed by Kyle. Even Express has talked about how Camila's role in that played very little into why they actually made the move. It was actually more of Kyle's info that made them make the move. And again, it just felt like she was a dead man walking in that end game stretch. To again, I just ultimately have so many holes in Camila's game here. And the fact that, again, she really just did not have much power throughout a lot of the game and just had no path to the end despite having win equity. To where, again, in comparison to Shiaen, I do think it is close. I do think it is the fact that she outplays Shiaen at the final 6 round that really leads to her being above him, because outside that, again, I think I could argue the opposite. But again, I think the fact that she does outplay him there and again got 1 round away from winning the game, I think it's at least something to credit her for. So again, she's here at number 4. Now number 3, and again, the top 3 on this list end up being the top 3 of the season. The question for me was the order, and at number 3, going with a player that again did surprise me by the end, where they had a much better ending to their season than I expected from them. To where, again, I initially was going to have them lower in this list, but I think where we're at right now, at number 3, I'm going to go with Eva. And Eva's this player here that, again, was in the majority for most of the season. Well, I knew she was not in the core of Logi, where we see, again, the California girls form, and she is really on the outskirts of that, just having her connection with Joe, though it seemed like she also had a decent connection with Shiaen. And again, I still think Star would have been the first to go there no matter what, and even beyond that, I think more than likely Bianca goes over Eva. So while, again, I do think her positioning on the original Logi is, like, not perfect, I think it is, like, good enough there to where, either way, again, she ends up building a strong bond with Joe, to where I don't think Joe would have ever turned on her at that point in the game, and when we get to the swap, again, I think she plays extremely well. Then latches on to David. It seems like her, David, and Mary had a pretty good relationship, to where, again, I think she's also, again, not in any danger there. Also gets to the point where Star ends up giving her idol, which, again, I don't know how much I'll credit Eva necessarily for that, where it felt like a spot where I think Star just would have done that to anybody that solved the combination. But still, I think Star feeling comfortable enough to give Eva the idol, despite the fact they were coming after each other earlier, again, is something to note there. But beyond that, again, we get to the merge. I think Eva's in a really strong position from that point forward. Again, obviously being in the strong alliance, and through that, again, has very strong ties to obviously Joe, Shiaen, David, Mary, and again, seemed to be the person like kind of keeping that alliance together, and again, stays stably in the majority as, again, Charity goes, Say goes, Chrissy goes, which again gets portrayed as her getting her way, even though, again, we do see her actually wanting Camila out. But yeah, obviously the David boot round, something to criticize. Again, her getting rid of David, I don't think was the correct play there. It's for someone that was pretty undyingly loyal to her. I think that's definitely a flaw there. Though again, still able to maintain that group when Star ends up going home, which also again, question of like, should she have gotten rid of Star or someone that she at least had inroads with, though ultimately again, I don't think Star would have really worked with her anyway at that point. Ozzy just stays the course during the merry round and sides with taking out Shiaen in a spot where again, does seem like she was tricked by Kyle and Camila into doing so, which is obviously not a great look, especially considering it felt like she didn't doubt it as much as Joe did. Now, beyond that, obviously, she was just locked safe Final 5, had the idol there, though obviously gets into a Final 4 situation where she does end up going to fire against Camila. Mind you, again, easily wins against Camila, so she was never in any true danger there, but I think it's a spot that really just highlights, again, the fact that her relationship with Kyle was just not as strong as her relationship with Joe, and I think that is the fundamental issues with Eva's game in terms of her ranking here. The fact that I do think Joe is the more integral piece of the puzzle than Eva. I think Joe was the linchpin of that majority alliance, had the closest relationship to Kyle, to Eva, to Shiaen, and I think the fact that Eva was just like one of the limbs of Joe in terms of their positioning in the alliance is something that does knock Eva down here. Though again, I think Eva was more self-aware of her game. Again, she clearly has a much better Final Tribal performance than Joe and willing to do things to undercut Joe in the way that she talked up her game. But again, I just was not enough by the end. But I do still feel like it's a spot where her navigation through the game is, again, obviously very clean. Again, there's never a point where she's in danger. Mind you, obviously a lot of that is due to the concept that she's a GOAT, and I don't think anyone thought she could win. But again, considering she did have a much better Final Tribal performance than expected, and also had some pretty strong relationships out there, I mean, especially during the early merge phase, and at least had some influence in how the votes played out by, again, working alongside Joe. I do ultimately think Eva lands here at number 3, not number 2. And at number 2 here, we're moving on to a player that I think is very tough to assess because I think this player plays an extremely dominant game. I think in most worlds, I would have this player at number 1. The problem comes from win equity / also intentionality. But I still feel like this player played probably one of the better non-winning games in history show, despite how unintentional it was. And at number 2, I'm going with Joe. And again, Joe, I think, is in a spot where his game is essentially Eva's, but then a step above it. I think he was better positioned throughout more of the game. Again, he obviously was part of the California girls that seemed to be the majority on the original Loggy tribe. He also had the connections with, again, Thomas and Shiaen, and also, again, had Star wanting to work with him. Also had the connection with Eva. There were really, he has these like one-on-one bonds with everyone there outside of Bianca. And again, it seemed like he had the influence to keep Eva safe if they ever had gone to enough tribals there, though even that wasn't obviously particularly likely. Now, he obviously gets blindside at the swap, though obviously that's because advantages are in play, and even then, again, he's never in danger. Again, it felt like it was always between Thomas and Shiaen. It felt like he was never a person that was going to be targeted there, where it seems like he builds a really strong bond with Kyle, to where Kyle becomes part of his fold, and again, we get to the merge where, again, he gets the strong alliance. They run their show during the early merge phase. Well, also, again, he ends up creating a solid core within that with, again, Eva, Shiaen, and Joe. Also is able to make bonds with people on the outside, like Mitch in particular. And again, Joe's really just in this dominant position from that point forward. Now, again, I think you could definitely qualm with, again, him not being active enough. I think there are points where we see his allies want to do things that he doesn't want to do, and he kind of relents to them, even though, again, he ultimately gets his way with, like, the Chrissy vote in particular. But, again, that's a spot where he kind of relented and let Camila be the target for a bit. But still, I think that's definitely a flaw in him as a player there. But it's still a spot where, again, it doesn't ultimately matter that much for him. It's really like a spot where, like, no matter what, he still has a solid backing around him. And I think the bigger thing criticized is obviously the David vote. Obviously, taking out David in the way he does, again, makes David very bitter at him. Also, the fact that I think him taking out David was just not the right call. Again, where I think David's more loyal to Joe than most other players in the game, and I think him getting rid of him at that point was definitely misguided. And again, we follow that with, like, talk about how he's the target, the falling around by the minority. Mind you, again, it didn't seem like it was ever going to happen. I don't think Mitch was actually willing to go to rocks to take out Joe in that position, but still a spot that, again, he could have just avoided all that by not taking out David. Now, obviously, he's able to stay in control during the Mary boot round as well, though that is a spot where he does get paranoid by the end. We end up seeing some very sloppy gameplay from him. And again, that just continues this, actually, of, again, Joe playing a very dominant game, but one where I do question his abilities as a player. The fact that he was just openly telling to Al and Mitch that we should split the vote when, again, there's not many other people to split the vote on. Again, definitely not a great look there. And then we get to the Shiaen boot round where, again, he's just outright tricked in that position. Kyle and Camila did trick him into thinking that Shiaen was coming after him and used that as an excuse to take out Shiaen in a spot where, again, I do not think that was the best move for him. I think easily the best move for him would have been to tell Shiaen that this was happening and that Kyle was throwing him under a bus and then vote out Mitch. And that way you have Kyle and Shiaen still going after each other the following round. Or even better is take the shot at Kyle and Camila, which, to be fair, again, credit to them, it does seem like it was because Joe and Eva just simply never realized the fact that Kyle and Camila were this duo in the game, despite the fact that other people seem to, which, again, another point where it's kind of a bad read on Joe. But again, I think the move to take out Shiaen here, it is a moment of them getting tricked. That being said, I don't think it's necessarily the worst case scenario for Joe, considering, again, you only have one more normal round of the game in a spot where Eva has an idol still. you can still win immunity. And that's not even a guarantee that you're going to be outnumbered at that point either, while Shiaen is, again, someone that is supposedly a big jury threat. Again, he could potentially beat you at the end, where, again, I think practically it's not the worst case scenario to get rid of Shiaen, but more so the motives behind it are, again, very flawed here. And beyond that, again, we get the final 5 where they still don't take the shot at Joe, which is, again, pretty insane. Now, again, obviously by that point, it was just kind of accepted the fact that Joe and Eva were likely goats and were just easy people to beat at the end, especially amongst the Sivas, where the Sivas would split votes, so where, again, there definitely was merit there. But I still think the fact that, again, there was still talk about how Joe is this big threat, and you still don't take the shot at him at 5. And even at 4, again, he's able to get Kyle to take him to the final 2. Again, not even throw him in fire in a spot where Joe is clearly the best fire maker, and someone that, again, would demolish Camila in the fire-making challenge. And despite that, again, Kyle never even considers putting Joe in fire, which, again, I think is very indicative of Joe's relationships. Again, I don't know if there is a winning scenario for him, especially in the endgame stretch there, where it seemed like he probably loses to everybody from the final 6 on, especially. I do think it's still a spot where Joe's relationships through the game are very impressive. Again, the fact that he was able to cultivate this alliance around him, also cultivate this culture around him, this notion that we should be playing with honesty and integrity, which seemed to bleed into Kyle. Again, Kyle never makes the move against Joe and does remain loyal to him the entire time, seemingly based off of this notion. While it's not even like we see Joe like having a particularly bad final trial performance, it's not like he, again, came off as hypocritical or pissed off the jury in any way. It just seemed like, again, Kyle was just more respected than him. And I think that's the thing that, again, makes Joe's game a lot very difficult to assess. As, again, I do think on paper, again, he is one of the best runner-up games in the history of the show. Now, again, I question him as a player, considering, again, I don't know how intentional it is. I don't know how often he finds that group around him. But I do think his initial strategy, again, is very sound in the sense that his entire game is based around building strong social bonds and making them connected to you to where they don't turn on you. And I do think that seemed to play in a very effective way on this season, in a way that despite there was so much talk about how big of a threat he is, they just simply never take the shot. And I do think Joe is someone that, again, for my money, I would personally vote for, was on the jury. I think the fact that, again, he was looked at as this linchpin and just no one ever took the shot at him is very impressive. But again, it is his lack of win equity here that really drops into the number 2 slot, especially on this player ranking, where, again, I am taking jury prospects in mind here. So, again, ultimately, I do have Joe here, number 2. Now, number 1, the number 1 player of the season. What a shocker. We got the winner of the season. We do have Kyle. And again, Kyle plays, again, a very impressive game for the majority of the game. Again, he is in the middle for a lot of the game. Again, on the original Siva, he is right in the middle alongside David and deciding who goes home. If they ever were to go to tribal, even though, again, very likely they've been voting for Chrissy. And again, it wasn't really in doubt. But still, again, I think does very good work there. Also builds a bond with Camila. I think the one big glaring red flag for him is his swap, where obviously that's a spot where he needs an idol to save himself. Again, I think the thing about this is, like, this is kind of one of these, like, weird situations with idols in play that I always have a tough time wrapping my head around. Because, again, I do think, again, if you need an idol to save yourself in the game, that is a massive flaw against your game. But at the same time, idols are still an aspect of the game. And through that, actively putting votes onto yourself so that you can use your idol effectively to progress yourself in the game is also a valid strategy as well. And I think Kyle is kind of the representative of that here. And the fact that him and Camila literally have this plan to get the votes onto Kyle so that he can play his idol. And I think that is something that, again, makes this very tough to dissect how much of a negative this really is. But again, him and Camila really just end up out playing the Loggies despite coming down in numbers, which, again, at the end of the day, again, still a position where he is swap screwed. So again, I really don't fault him too much for what happens here, even though I do think it's a position where Camila does play better than he does during that round. But again, it seems like through that he's able to build this really strong bond with Joe, and by the time of the merge, ends up being in this really central position where, again, he's part of this strong 6 alliance. He also has his strong bond of Camila, and it feels like he is in a pretty powerful position at that point in the game to really just go whatever way he wanted. And obviously he ends up siding with the strong 6. Again, they end up really running the show the early portion of the season. I will definitely flaw him for, again, his constant attempts to take out Shiaen, which felt pretty misguided considering it felt like Shiaen was with him and Camila. But again, I don't think that was the correct call to be making, especially because he ultimately fails at it, but still maintains his spot in the majority. Technically ends up getting his way during the Chrissy vote round, where that was one where, again, there was a lot of infighting there within the alliance, but he ends up ultimately getting his way, ends up convincing Joe go his way. And again, I'll obviously criticize the fact that, again, he didn't add Camila to the alliance to begin with, which, again, causes all these issues to begin with. Or again, if he had just added Camila to the alliance to begin with, they wouldn't have to fight for keeping her there. But again, I still do think ultimately plays that well, gets his way, and ultimately plays extremely well during the David boot round. Again, is able to get Joe and Eva, these very loyal players, to turn against one of their main alliance members, which again, I think is very impressive there. Now, obviously we get to the Star boot round where he had an opportunity to take a shot at his core group and doesn't, which I don't really fault him for. I do think again, at that position, again, worst comes to worst, he's at Final Four with fire making. Again, I think it's more so flawed the format that someone like Kyle be willing to ride with this 4 more so than a fault against him, as I don't think he has really any big incentive to do so, especially at that specific point, as either way, again, he would still be a potential swing at 7 also. So again, I don't really fault him too much for how that round plays out. And again, he talks about taking out Joe, doesn't do it at the Mary boot, but eventually makes a move at the Shiaen boot round. Again, finally him executing on the Shiaen vote. Mind you, again, I think a questionable move. Now, though, to be fair, again, the way he plays this move, again, is very impressive. Again, doing it in a way that, again, made it so Joe and Shiaen wouldn't really communicate. Mind you, again, really should have. I think that's more so a feeling on Joe as a player that they don't. Because even though I do think it's, again, good play to tell Joe about Shiaen having an idol so that he's scared about Shiaen playing the idol, really, at the end of the day, again, Joe has immunity at that point, so what does it matter? But again, it ends up working anyway. But ultimately, I do think the Shiaen move turns out to be the right move. Again, at the time I did question it. I do think now knowing the fact that, again, Joe and Eva were undyingly loyal to Kyle once Shiaen goes, again, that is very strong for Kyle. Also, the fact that it was correct in the fact that he does beat Joe and Eva. And again, I think it shows a lot of awareness from Kyle in the fact that, again, he does get into a pretty strong endgame path. I will say the one major criticism here is that while, again, obviously he does vote out Mitch at 5, and that puts him into a Final Four situation where, again, he is very confident in his fire-making ability. I do think it's a spot where it does leave him a little bit vulnerable, particularly from a Camila winning final immunity, where obviously she would put him against Joe, and that would definitely be a question mark there. And just in general, also the notion of Camila being there in a spot where, again, if she gets to the end with him, he likely loses, which is also, again, not great. But obviously, he did do a lot to optimize his path to get to the end against Joe and Eva. Obviously, again, him winning immunity works out perfectly. To where, while, again, I still question his overall decision to not put Joe in fire over Eva, where I think Joe would have had an even easier time beating Camila. It still was a move that ultimately, again, doesn't matter too much, considering Camila just seemed to be a really bad fire maker to begin with. But also, again, I do think, even in the world where Joe and Eva win immunity, which, again, not a great situation considering, again, he is guaranteed to go in fire, it's still a spot where, again, I think he felt very confident in his fire-making ability to beat Camila. So ultimately, I do think he plays the end game here in a way that, again, while he is had more danger of going into fire than I would personally like, I still think he likely knew the odds of how this would play out, and ultimately, obviously, gets to a perfect Final 3 situation here of him against Joe and Eva, against two people who seem to be perceived as GOATs, also having a jury of a lot of his peers. I would reward him with the win. And while, again, I don't think his final trial performance is as good as I personally would have wanted it to be, I do think he ultimately really plays into his game pretty well here. Now, again, I do question his overall win equity against other opponents, again, the likes of Camila, Mitch, Shiaen, but again, obviously, he plays for this Final 3 and does get to this Final 3. And again, ultimately defeats a player like Joe, who, again, was constantly talked about as a big threat. While again, I do think they constantly talk about how Joe is a big threat and that he would run away with the game, and Kyle not making a move at that point does seem questionable. It turns out to actually be the correct call for him due to the relationship he had with Joe that made Joe and Eva actively want to take him to Final 3, especially once he was able to take Shiaen out of the game. To where ultimately, again, I think Kyle's game is very impressive here. While you obviously have the Thomas situation as a knock, and the fact that he kind of needed an idol, and beyond that also was, like, again, not part of the true core of the majority alliance, the fact that obviously Joe and Eva were more so on top of that group. Again, the way that he was able to play around them and get them to do what he wanted them to do and then ultimately beat them at the end, I do think it's something to give a lot of credit to Kyle here for. So again, I do ultimately have Kyle here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my player ranking for Survivor 48. The end of my coverage of Survivor 48. So beyond this, obviously, I will be covering Survivor 49 when that eventually comes up. Also, we got A vs. the World coming in a not too distant future. And also, obviously, we do have the Survivor 50 cast at this point. And again, maybe expect some videos revolving around Survivor 50 in the not too far future. Obviously, beyond that, we got Big Brother 27 as well. And I'll be doing other Big Brother content. Again, in general, just expect more of the same. Expect more of the same style of content for down the road. But again, that is the end of my coverage of Survivor 48. Thank you for watching.